Major General Carl G. Schneider, United States Army Air Force, Korea. General Schneider enlisted in the United States Army after World War II in 1946 and began work with the 509th Bomb Group as a turret gunner. During the Korean War, he served with the 51st Fighter Group and flew over 100 combat missions. He also served during Vietnam. General Schneider was inducted into the Arizona Aviation Hall of Fame in 2009, and he's one of my aviation heroes. He's an amazing man, and I'm happy to bring you his story today. He's still with us at the age of 94, and I say God bless General Schneider for the history that he shared with me on July 5th, 2007 in Phoenix, Arizona. And Brandon Glidden, thank you again for sponsoring this story, making it possible for others to learn from this story. And thank you for your service in the United States Army. So folks, I'm glad to bring to you, proud to bring to you another story from the Voices of History YouTube channel. And with the thought, freedom is not free, folks. Freedom is never free. We're fighting for the same freedoms in our own country today that our veterans fought for. And just don't ever take it for granted. And our young people today who were born in a free country, watch these stories, learn from them, and be grateful and thankful to our God and to our military for the price paid for the freedoms that we have today. Again, thank you for watching, and God bless you.
Uh, 1946.
Okay, Air Force?
Went in the Army Air Force as a buck private and went through basic training and then through technical school. Took a 6-month course in called Remote Control Turret Mechanic course on B-29s. And then I went to the 509th Bomb Group, which was the group that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. But of course this was after the war. I was not there during that period. And worked on all the guns and then flew as a gunner in the B-29 before I went to pilot training.
And so as you got in close to Korea, I mean, World War II was over, and Korea started, what, June of 1950?
Right.
And can you just give me a quick history of Korea? Why were you even involved in that conflict?
Well, basically, we had not, the Secretary of State had made a speech, I think precipitated some of the problem, and he made a speech, I believe in January of 1950, and said, he outlined where our areas of interest were, and they went from Alaska down through Japan, down through Okinawa, Philippines, and so forth, and either inadvertently or by design left out Korea. And in '49, we had pulled out all the occupation troops except for a very small cadre of advisors for the Korean forces. And the North Koreans saw an opportunity. They thought that we weren't really interested and we would not come in. And if we came in, it'd be too late. They had an overwhelming force that they planned to go very rapidly down and just take over the whole southern peninsula. And that's when Truman said, they asked for help to evacuate all of the U.S. members out of Seoul and out of South Korea. And so we sent airplanes up right away to help fly top cover for the transports getting people out of there and the convoys getting them out of there. And then he went to the United Nations and got approval for us to send U.S. forces in there. And then Russia was on, they had a MAD at us, I guess, at the time, And they were not there, so they couldn't vote against it. So it was approved for the United Nations to send forces into Korea. And so we started, the units that were stationed in Japan, the fighter units, started flying, I think, 2 or 3 days after June the 25th. I was on Okinawa, just finishing a tour there, and just ready to come home on June the 25th when the war started. And the wing commander came in, he said, okay guys, said, you got a choice. You can either go on home, but you're likely to come back over here because the war is just getting started. So if you want to volunteer, you can stay here and go on with us. So we all did, every 100% all volunteered to go on. We moved up to Japan, up to Itazuki, southern Japan, and flew out of there then and helped support the Pusan perimeter when they were right down close to the very edge of Korea. And then we moved up to Seoul after the Incheon invasion and flew out of there until the Chinese came in about November, December. And then they chased us back out of the Seoul area. We moved back to Japan and then on over to a place called Tsuiki, Tsuiki, and flew out of there then, or at least I flew out of there until I finished my missions and came home in May of 1951.
Okay. Tell me about the Chosin Reservoir, the operation, the campaign, and then what your involvement was.
Well, the Marines had gone up the East Coast, up to the Huachon Reservoir, and when the Chinese came rolling in, they saw that they were just totally overwhelmed. They had no choice but to advance to the rear. So that we had every Navy plane and Marine plane that could fly on the East Coast. And then a lot of us also went up there, and I think I flew about 11 missions, capping the Marines and shooting up Chinese on either side of the road. They just had one road coming out of there. And then I capped that C-119 when he dropped at Bailey Bridge so they could get across that ravine, which had stopped the whole convoy. And they dropped, I think, 6 big sections, and 4 of them, as I recall, were lost, went off the side of the mountain, but they saved 2 of them enough to get them across this gap, and so the convoy could get out of there. And then they came back to Hamhung and Hungnam, which was on the East Coast, and loaded all these boats and got all the Marines out of there.
What about the Army? They were overrun. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I had several friends. One thing that we had to do is serve a tour as a forward air controller. And you went up with the infantry and then called in airstrikes. And several of my squadron were up there with infantry units, up right around Pyongyang and on up toward the Yalu River when the Chinese came in. And of course they started retreating because they were just overwhelmed and left thousands of trucks and guns and everything. So for several days, all we did was go up and shoot up our own trucks so they couldn't get it. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and so forth. Because the troops, they just got totally jammed. They blew up some of the tanks and stopped the roads. It was hard to do anything off-road with the rice paddies and everything. So it was just a total traffic jam for miles and miles there.
Now you were, again, in support of the Chosin Reservoir campaign. I mean, were you flying cover support? What were you doing again?
Well, we were covering the Marines along with the Navy, off the carriers off the coast, and the Marine Corps fighters. We had missions to go up and help. It was just an all-out effort to try to shoot up enough enough Chinese along. They were coming down off the mountains, and we were trying to hold them back so that our Marines could get out of there.
Were you aware of what was going on below?
Oh yeah, yeah. We were right down. We were mud fighters. We were right down in the. You'd go down 50 feet above the ground, fire rockets and shoot 50 caliber machine guns at them.
So what are your targets then?
Well, they were mainly individuals and 50 caliber machine guns. Mainly, they had some, I guess, hand-drawn artillery pieces and mortars. But anytime we could see any kind of movement or pick out anything that was not on the road, we knew it was an enemy, so you just go in and shoot them up.
How do you feel about that? Are you trained for this? Is it is it surreal, or are you conscious of what you're doing there? I mean,
Well, you're trained to do it, and you're so concentrated on what you're doing that I didn't feel a whole lot of emotion. You're doing your job, and you knew these are the bad guys, and they're trying to kill your guys, and you go in and shoot them up.
was it like a video game of today where the kids are shooting these things?
Well, I don't know. No, you have a lot of emotion on the ground. I can honestly say never felt fear in the air, but I've gone to the tailpipe and tossed my cookies before and after a few missions because you're getting shot at constantly. You know, they're just shooting at you from every direction as you're down, going down low. And then, of course, when you're up along the Yalu, they had big guns shooting from across the river, and just solid flak. It just looked like you're going through a black rain cloud. And many times you knew one guy wasn't coming back, and they didn't. You know, you'd lose one guy out of a flight of 4. And of course, being young and stupid, well, you always knew it was going to be the other guy. You never thought it was going to be you. But the main job was just protecting your buddies like you did on the ground in the infantry.
So as far as asking you, did you realize what was going on below? I mean, the cold temperatures, I'm assuming that would affect your operations too.
Yeah, it was half the time we had drawn our forces down so far after World War II that we didn't have parts for the aircraft. And a lot of times the heaters didn't work in the aircraft, and you're cold in the air and on the ground. And we first got up there, we didn't even have heaters, and we slept in these pup tents, two-man pup tents. And then we finally we all helped build them a wooden floor, and the wood came up about 4 feet above the ground. Then we'd put a tent over the top of that. But we didn't even have heaters there for first couple of months. And it was cold. That was one of the coldest winters I guess they'd ever had in Korea. So you put everything you could put on, and you flew with everything you could put on. You put on your long johns, and then you put on your old OD shirt and pants, and then a pair of coveralls, and then your flying suit, and a B-15 jacket, and then a flak vest, and a MAJ survival, and a 45, and you were just shoehorned into the cockpit. It was really tight. And the gun sight was about 2 inches from your nose.
Now, you were aware again of didn't we sustain a lot of casualties at the Chosin Reservoir down in the ground?
Yeah.
A lot of the Marines even froze. I mean, it was quite at the time, were you aware of the severity of the elements, or was it afterwards and the casualties, and were we defeated at the Chosin Reservoir?
Well, the Marines would say we were not defeated. They advanced to the rear. They were overwhelmed. And the intelligence did not pick up the fact that all these thousands of Chinese were coming across the border. And so everybody was surprised by the numbers that came across the border. And they were traveling at night. They were super camouflaged. Boy, they would camouflage. They could get under trees or branches and so forth. And you couldn't see a lot of them during the daytime. But in the early days, they'd even camouflage their trains. They'd put stuff over the top of them. But several times I caught a train just at sunrise, and the smoke would be coming up through the camouflage, and you'd go in and shoot 4 rockets into the engine and blow it up, and then go back and blow up the last car. And if it was an ammo train, it looked like an atomic bomb. The whole thing it'd go 30,000 feet in the air, just blowing up all over the place. But they were super good at camouflage, and then they didn't have a lot of vehicles, so they could disperse into all these gullies and under vegetation, and then they had all kind of camouflage with them.
Tell me about were they trained well, do you know, and were they in great numbers?
They were in great numbers, yeah. I don't know what the actual figure was, but it was just like a swarm of ants coming down there. And our troops we even had troops right up on the Yalu River when they first hit. And then we had another group coming up the west coast, and then the Marines were coming up the east coast. And if the Chinese hadn't come in, we'd have had the whole thing wrapped up by Christmas of 1950.
So we were fighting the North Koreans, and then the Chinese came in.
Yep. we had already defeated the North Koreans. After we broke out of the Pusan perimeter, we were hitting all the North Koreans, and then the Incheon invasion, we had decimated the North Koreans just down to a ragtag outfit. And by the time the troops were getting up around Pyongyang and on up toward the Yalu, there was hardly any resistance at all until the Chinese hit.
And what kind of aircraft were you flying at this time?
F-80 Shooting Star.
And it's got bombs and machine guns?
Bombs, rockets, and machine guns, yeah.
And you're by yourself?
Yep. That's the way I like to fly.
Formation of how many again?
Usually 4.
Got a point?
But
In a trail, or what do you have?
well, we'd fly formation. You'd usually, going out, you just fly what's called a spread formation. Spread out flights of 2, so you can just sort of weave back and forth so you can see any airplane coming up behind you. And if it's a big raid, they moved a bunch of yaks across the river, and I think I was in one big dogfight where we had 48 airplanes on our side, and I don't know how many on their side, but it was just a swirl of airplanes. And then all of a sudden, everything's gone. They headed back north, and we headed back south. And I got a couple of, I'm sure I got two MiGs, but they were smoking, went into the clouds, and my gun camera film didn't work, so I didn't get credit for them. You had to either have gun camera film or you had to actually see them hit and have somebody else observe it. But anyway, I had some good dogfights. That's why I wanted to fly another 100 in F-86s, because I knew if I could, in those early days, if I could get an 86, which was much more comparable to the MiG. The F-80 didn't have the speed or the power that the MiG had. The MiG could zoom down and get above you, and you didn't have enough power to get up and get them. So what you do is wait until they start shooting at you, and then pull into them real tight and pull your power and pop the speed brake and hope they'd overshoot you, and then you'd be right on their tail, and you could really get some good hits on them.
So now, as far as the operation below, that went from what, November to December at the Chosin Reservoir?
Yeah, it was, I started to lose track of time. I think it was, yeah, it should have been about just before Christmas there. It seemed like it was after Thanksgiving and before Christmas.
Now you mentioned dogfights, so there were enemy aircraft over the Chosin Reservoir?
No, I don't recall we ever had any. I didn't find any at all up there. That was a little bit past their range. They were mainly along the east or the west coast, and this, of course, was up on the northeast coast.
Do you know geographically what the Chosin Reservoir was or its purpose? I mean,
well, they were just advancing on up to clear up the whole peninsula to try to unify the entire North and South Korea.
Americans were trying to do that? Or?
Yep. Well, all the United Nations forces. I've forgotten how many total nations we had involved, but we had, you know, you had the Australians, you had the British, Canadians, and bits and pieces of quite a few other countries that provided medical support, supplies, and a lot of other services. Not as big an active combat force as we had, but substantial support.
And after it's all said and done, did you ever interact with any of these Marines that were on the ground, and did they tell you stories about the cold or about the enemy or anything?
Yeah, I went to Marine Corps Staff School a few years later and had several of the guys that were in my class. So we talked about it a lot. But my one classic story with the Army was on the West Coast, and I was flying a mission after the Chinese started coming in, and got a call from an infantry captain was surrounded, his company was surrounded, and they were down in this deep valley. And he said, but I don't see how you can get in here because the clouds are right down on the mountain tops. And I had flown so much up that way, I knew every power line and river and ravine up there. And I was up above, and I said, well, I think I know how to get down there. So I went out over the ocean and came up the river and put my flight in a real tight trail and came up to a certain power line and turned, and there was just enough gap in the mountains there between the clouds and the ground, probably 200 feet. And we went through this gap and got into this valley, and it's a real deep valley. So then we spread out and we shot up hundreds of Chinese. And a few weeks later, I was in Tokyo, went back down there on R&R, rest and relaxation. And I was in the university club, and I heard this Army captain up there talking about how this Air Force outfit had saved his hide, and he was talking about it. So I went up and tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, I think I'm the guy that saved your butt up there. He gave me a big hug, and he said, the drinks are on me. I'll pay for everything. So that was sort of a fun, to know that you really could help the guys. They were able to get out then. We come down some ravines and got out of there.
Now, you mentioned the Chinese were in great numbers. Obviously, we were outnumbered, and there was a retreat of such where it drove us back, right? I mean, is that what?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they drove us, our forces, clear back down below Seoul. They retook Kimpo where we were flying, and when we pulled out, we burned everything. Didn't have enough transport to get it all out, so we just piled everything up, and everything you could get in there that you couldn't carry out. We just had super big bonfires to burn it so they couldn't get it. And then we went back. I've sort of lost track of the exact dates, but in the spring, then we worked our way back through Seoul and reoccupied Seoul and Kimpo.
What was the hardest part of what was the hardest thing you had to do in Korea as far as combat?
Well, losing all your good friends is probably the toughest part, because I'd been through flying school with a lot of these guys. We'd been in an outfit down in South Carolina for a year, then a year on Okinawa. So many of us had been together for 3 years, and some of them I'd gone to college with, and so it was really tough to lose all your good buddies. And I was, in addition to being a fully combat-ready fighter pilot, I was also an administrative officer. I was running all the administration, and then I was a mobility officer, so I had to organize the movement of the unit. So I was working about 18, 20 hours a day, and then to lose all your good friends just day after day after day was really tough emotionally. And I was talking to the veterans the other day. I said, you know, you didn't dare admit that you were having a head problem when you came home, because they'd ground you, wouldn't let you fly. So I just had to work out my own psychology when I came back. And finally went up in the mountains up in Colorado and just sat up there and hated the world for 2 weeks, and decided I wasn't hurting anybody but myself. So as I said, when I came down off the mountain, I was okay. I was normal, and I just psychoanalyzed myself and got back on track. But I really had a head problem, and that's my big concern now about a lot of these guys coming back from the Middle East. You know, they don't have any visible scars. Maybe they didn't get any kind of a leg blown off or an arm blown off, but I guarantee you, when you get shot at every day for quite a while, it messes up your head, and that's my big concern right now. I think we're getting good treatment with all the artificial limbs and so forth, but there are going to be a lot of guys that are going to carry a lot of deep scars, just I'm sure like guys did in World War II and coming back from Korea.
So now you talk about what you're talking about in context of Korea, of losing men. I mean, are you out on missions and you lose a friend, or you just hear about it? I mean, are you there with them when he gets shot down?
Yeah, you saw him go down.
Tell me where you were in Korea and what engagement, and because it wasn't at the Chosin Reservoir then, there's probably another engagement.
Well, we were flying all over Korea. Mm-hmm. We flew all around the Pusan perimeter and shot up the North Koreans when they were engaging our forces in the early days, trying to take over. You know, we just had a very small little, I don't know how many acres or how many miles, but probably 20 or 30 miles either way, just one little corner of the country. And so we'd take off. We had one base there called Taegu, and we'd take off and just fire rockets and shoot our guns and drop bombs on the troops that were fighting up around the the Pusan perimeter. And then after we moved to Kimpo, after the Inchon invasion, we were just hitting targets, what's called route recce. You'd go up and try to find trains or trucks or tanks or anything that was enemy equipment or people in North Korea, and shoot up anything you could find up there. So we flew all over the peninsula.
But can you take me on a mission? Just tell me what happened. What type of anti-aircraft fire going on, and to see a plane tumble or whatever happens when they're shot down, or?
Well, you'd typically, just one mission that I particularly recall, you'd brief about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you'd have a wing briefing, what the targets were for the day or what the missions were, and then you'd have a squadron briefing with a little more detail, and then a flight briefing, which would be maybe the flight of 4, and whoever was leading the flight, and all of us were flight leads. Sometimes we'd fly the lead, and sometimes we'd fly number 2 or number 3 or number 4. So you brief the flight on the procedures of taxiing out and the radio frequencies and what you're going to do when you joined up and so forth. And we had a North Korean little biplane that used to come over at night and drop one bomb on the runway. And we called him Bed Check Charlie. He'd come over just about the time we'd get ready to go to bed. So the entertainment for the evening was to walk out and watch Bed Check Charlie drop his little bomb. And they'd try to shoot him down, but he'd stay right on the deck, and he had no lights, and he'd go down the river. And I don't know whether they ever shot him down or not, but this one night he dropped this bomb on the right-hand side of the runway, and we had the wing briefing, the squadron briefing, the flight briefing, and on all 3 briefings, I was going to fly. I was supposed to be number 4 in the flight on that particular mission, and on each one they said, do not take off on the right side of the runway because we have a 2.5-ton truck and a couple of airmen out there repairing this bomb. It'd only be about 2 or 3 feet deep, but it'd be enough that you couldn't take off on it because your gear would hit in the bomb crater. And so they said the briefing was for the leader to take off on the left side, and you always lined up in what's called echelon, and then you'd run up and check all your instruments and everything, and then the leader would roll, and 15 seconds later, then number 2 would roll, and you're supposed to get over to the left in trail and take off on the left side, and then number 3 is already lined up over on the left side, number 4 is on the right. And so number 3 would go straight ahead, and then number 4 is supposed to come over and take off on the left. Well, as we were going out to the airplane, this buddy of mine, a classmate of mine, had flown the airplane that I was assigned to, and I had flown the plane that he was assigned to the day before. And he said, hey, but let's swap airplanes. Things were pretty loose in those days. So I said, okay. So he got in my airplane and I got in his. And so that changed our positions. That put me in number 3 position. I was going to keep the same position in the flight, but I was in his airplane. And so here he was in my airplane. He was on the right wing. So leader took off okay. Number 2 took off okay. I took off okay on the left side. And for some reason, he didn't hear the briefing, and he went right down the right side and ran into this 2.5-ton truck. And of course, the whole thing exploded, and I was just joining up on the lead element, and I looked over my shoulder, and it looked like an atomic bomb going off on a runway. And of course, he was burned so badly, and everybody thought it was me because that was the plane I was supposed to be flying. And we had a young airman in our orderly room, and since I was also the administrative officer, that was very superstitious. And he could see a ghost on any occasion. He was very superstitious. So here I took off on this mission and flew for 2 hours on the mission, came back, debriefed, and walked into the orderly room. And he saw me, and of course, the word had gone out that I'd been killed in this crash. And here I walked in the orderly room, and he took off out of that tent, and we couldn't find him for 2 days. He took off running and went down to the local village, and he thought he'd seen a ghost, and I'd come back to life. But that was a humorous end to a very tragic situation. And In fact, the guy whose brother was killed came by to see me recently, and he had never really heard the whole story. So I visited with him, and he had lunch with me, and I told him the story. And he had never really heard exactly what happened.
So at the Chosin Reservoir, when you're flying a mission, and your targets are people and what have you, but I mean, how fast are you flying?
You're 300 or 400 miles an hour.
Can you see what's the result of
Yeah.
your attacks?
Yeah, you can see real well. Yeah, we all had good eyesight, and it's not as, you feel like it's pretty well in slow motion. It's not, you think of 300 to 400 miles an hour is pretty fast, but you can pick out everything on the ground, and you could aim right to it, and of course you're getting shot at all the time, and that gets pretty interesting.
But are they shooting with small arms or artillery or what?
Well, they were shooting around the Chosin Reservoir. They were not able to bring big guns there, but they'd shoot at you with small arms, and then they'd shoot at you with 50 calibers. They would carry 50 calibers. They could hand carry those. However, you really got hit at with the big stuff up along the Yellow River, where they had these tremendous, I guess they were German 88 millimeter flak guns, just like they had over Berlin and Ploiesti and Schweinfurt and so forth in World War II. And they were radar controlled, and they'd come, you could see these big black puffs coming up your tail, and you'd brake real hard, and then, boy, in about 2 seconds later here, they'd come up your tail here. And many times they'd get one guy out of the flight and just blow you apart. But around the Chosin Reservoir, it was mainly small arms fire, and then a lot of the Chinese would just sit down and point their gun straight up and just hope you'd hit a bullet coming in real low, shooting at them.
Would the bullets penetrate the fuselage of that plane, or I mean?
Well, a small arms fire would just ding it, but a 50 caliber, yeah, it could put a hole through your wing. And I've come back when I was over on the West Coast with holes in the back of the airplane. I had one that came in one side and came clear out the other side, and I could stand on one side and stick my head clear through the fuselage, and it missed my control cables by about half an inch, and luckily it didn't get them, so I got back. But the old F-80 was a lot like the P-47 in World War II, a real rugged airplane, and it would take a lot of punishment. So you get a lot of holes in an airplane and still come back.
How many missions do you think you flew during the Chosin Reservoir?
Probably 10 or 12, something like that. But I didn't really look it up in my log.
And over Korea as a whole, several hundred missions? Maybe?
No, I just flew 100 combat missions. Okay. Yeah, that was enough. You get shot at every day.
Right, and you mentioned the stress of that. How did you unwind or were debriefed? I mean, how did you?
We drank a lot of beer. We'd party it up pretty heavy at night, and you sort of had to forget it to decompress. And then and different people took it different ways. I just had the feeling I was going to make it, and I didn't lose as much sleep of it as some of them did. But if you're really a nervous Nelly, they would call them, why they'd really worry about it.
I don't usually ask this question, so understand it, but did you ever think about how many Chinese you killed during those runs?
No, it was strictly, you're just doing your job, and you don't, just like the reporter asked the Marine how he felt about, what he felt being a sniper, and he said recoil. That was about it. No, it's really an impersonal type. You don't have a feeling of it that you're doing that, or if you're shooting at another airplane, you're shooting at the airplane, and you don't really think about the individual in the airplane. At least I didn't. And I was the same way on the ground. I figured these are guys that were trying to shoot and kill my guys, and so I was going to get them.
Was there an adrenaline rush about what you did?
Yeah, you're pretty high. You're really concentrating, but there's a lot of emotion. I mean, a lot of, I guess you would say a rush to do it, and it was sort of a letdown when you got on the ground. And then you started thinking about Bill or Joe that didn't come back, and all the flack he'd gone through, and hits on your airplane and so forth.
And you're ready to do it again the next day.
Yeah, just get up and go do it again. It's sort of like being on the ground. I went to Vietnam, and I went out on a lot of ground patrols with the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And I found out I'd much rather be shot at in the airplane with a nice warm cockpit around me than being down on the ground where they're shooting directly at you and you got bullets spraying all over the dirt around you.
What was your rank during the Korea?
I was a lieutenant, and then I got was promoted to spot captain, which was a temporary combat rank because of my job. I was a squadron adjutant plus mobility, and that called for a captain in combat. But when I came home, I went back to first lieutenant, and then I got re-promoted to captain about a year later.
Carl, why do you think Korea is referred to as the Forgotten War?
Well, nobody seemed to really care when you came home. It was not active like you're talking about in your film. When you came back from Vietnam, you put on your civilian clothes, or else these idiots would spit at you and call you a baby killer and all these other things. Korea was just, people were just not concerned. My example was I went back to my hometown and I saw this old buddy of mine and he said, "Where you been?" And I said, "Well, I've been in Korea, just for 100 combat missions." He said, oh, well, let's go have a beer. And that was it. He didn't ask any questions. Nobody was interested. Nobody asked you to give speeches. Nobody came over and said thank you or anything else. It was just total unconcern, I guess is the best way to put it. There was not an active anti-war movement that I knew of. And certainly I never experienced any of the, I don't know what you'd call it, disrespect or antagonism or animosity that you did coming back from Vietnam. It just, the whole country would just sort of, well, okay, you went over and fought a war, so what? You know, it just really pretty tough to accept that, and that's part of what messed up your head. But you know, as you said in the film, when a lot of guys didn't come home right back after World War II, they were occupation forces, so they got to go out to the gas houses and drink beer and relax and take it easy, and then you came home on a boat and you had a decompression period. I thought that was really good in your film. And we didn't have that in Korea or in Vietnam. You just go from combat. One day you've been getting shot at and you've lost your friends and you've been living under really tough conditions, eating lousy food. And next day you get off the plane in California and everybody's going about their business. And same thing I'm sure that a lot of the guys feel coming back from the Middle East right now. And I was in Chicago last week and I saw some of the guys coming back, and of course I always try to go up and shake hands with them and thank them. But I think it's probably 10 years before anybody thanked me after I came back from Korea. And I haven't been thanked more than a half a dozen times since I came back from Vietnam. So it's sort of hard to go defend your country and then feel that the great American public doesn't appreciate what you're doing.
Carl, tell me about freedom. As a veteran, what does freedom mean to you, and tell me about the price of freedom?
Well, I was raised in my father was in a little background. My grandfather came from Germany because he didn't like the way things were going in Germany. And my father fought in World War I, and my mother was very patriotic. And so I was just raised with the understanding that three of us boys were all going to go in the military and serve our country. And I guess the longer and the more I speak, like in the Joe Foster program, the more I appreciate what a tremendous opportunity we have here to do anything you want to do. You know, I was able to serve 32 years in the Air Force, and I got out, and I've been in 6 businesses and made a few $1 million, and I've been very successful. And just a great, get in your car and go where you want to go, fly where you want to go, and the world is your oyster if you want to get out there and hustle. And I've traveled all over the world now, and I've been in 12 countries, 27 states, and all the Canadian provinces just in the last 5 years. And next week we're going to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. But I've been in a lot of these countries where you don't have the freedom to do what we have here. And that's what I try to put across to these kids in great middle schools and high school. You know, if we don't continue, I'm really concerned about radical Islam. I think the Islamic radicals are just as dangerous as the Nazis were in World War II, or before World War II and during, and that the communists were during the 40 years that we were in the Cold War. And I think we've got to wake up as American public, or else we're going to lose the freedoms. And my concern is that we're going to end up, if we don't stay firm with what we're doing now in the Middle East, we're going to have bomb threats in our shopping centers and in our airports and at ball games in 3 to 5 years if the Islamists, they want to conquer the world just like the communists did, just like Hitler did, and like the Japanese did in World War II. And I think it's just as big a threat. And I've read about 10 books now on the Islamic religion, and it's not a religion of peace. It's one that we've got to wake up people to, and nobody wants to call it what it is. You know, I can't imagine that we would have let the Nazis, the Germans, and I'm German origin, but we would not have let the Nazis have a big mosque and preach hatred against the United States in World War II. And here we're letting all these radical imams sit there and incite rioting to all these young impressionable kids, and I don't see them sending their kids out to fight. You know, they're the elite that plan the stuff like the bombing of the World Trade Center, and they enlist all these ignorant young people that don't know any better and that strap stuff around themselves and blow people up. And I think we've really got a serious threat. And if we pull out and come home now, I think they'll follow us home. The Viet Cong didn't follow you home, and the North Koreans didn't follow you home, but I think the radical Islamists will do that.
What does the American flag mean and represent to you as a veteran?
Well, it's just a symbol of the country, and it's something that I don't know how to put it. It really makes you want to do what we all did in combat, to be willing to put your tail on the line for your country. And I've been in enough countries now to know what a great opportunity we have here, and I want my kids and my grandkids and great-grandkids to have the same lifestyle that I've had. And if we don't all stiffen our backbone and don't let the liberals get the upper hand, we're not going to be able to preserve what we've all fought for and millions of other ancestors have fought for. And you can't do it all by diplomacy. But it's got to be a coordinated effort. It's got to be financial, economic, political. My big concern is that the Islamists are going to try to use our judicial system to try to outmaneuver us. And if we don't stay firm, they'll sure do it. We've already got one now up in Minnesota that took his oath on the Koran, and that's, to me, was a very bad precedent. So I guess I'm a dyed-in-the-wool patriot, and I really want to preserve what we've got.
I agree with that. That's right. Obviously, you're proud to be a veteran of our country.
You better believe, yep. Yep, I'm proud of my service. I'm proud that I've served the country, and both my brothers served in the military, and my brothers-in-law and my son-in-law, and I think we've got to all do our part. Not everybody has to be in the military, but I wish we had every student out of high school that had to serve a year at least in some service, not military necessarily, but serving other people. That's the main thing. And we've got to we've got a lot of great kids in these schools. I see some wonderful kids like the ones that did this Veterans Project, wonderful kids. But we've got a lot of them that don't appreciate what we have and all the sacrifices that many previous generations have given to preserve and keep all these freedoms.
One more question, Carl. What should our country remember about the Korean War?
Well, I'm going back over there in September with a group of other fighter pilots. And what I think about is that now we've got millions of Koreans that have lived in freedom in Southern Korea because of what we all did. And I think that's, in retrospect now, 50 years later, it really gives me a great feeling to go in. I'm going to go into Seoul, and I trained a lot of the Korean pilots right after the war, so I'm going to get to see them. And I've got a lot of good friends in Korea that really wonderful people. They've lived in freedom all these years now, for 50 years, instead of like their cousins and their aunts and uncles and parents and so forth still up in North Korea that have just been starved to death and lived under a terribly repressive society. So it makes me feel good to know that I helped. And if you go to Korea now, if you, even a cab driver over age 50, he'll ask you if you've served during the Korean War. And if you did, he'll say, "Thank you, sir." And you know, it's the only country that I've traveled to all over the world where every senior, now the young people don't have, they have a lot of the same problems some of our young people have. But the senior ones, they know what we did and what a contribution we had, or else they wouldn't be here. I go to a tailor shop with a Korean gentleman, Mr. Kim, and every time I go in there, he thanks me. He says, "You know, I wouldn't be here if you hadn't fought the war over there." And that makes you feel good to know that millions of people have lived in freedom for 50 some odd years because of what we sacrificed 50 years ago.
That's so true. That's important. Yes. Well, I think I've covered what I wanted to ask you about Korea. I thought I had one more question about that. I guess what I'm trying to get out of you too is your perspective of the Chosin Reservoir and what you did in Korea. Most of the people I've talked to have been on the ground, you know, in that.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, just looking back at that, and my father served during the Korean War, but don't know anything about it because he's dead. But so it's been interesting learning more about that country, and what you just said about them thanking you that's good to hear. I mean, that's a good thing.
Well, we did a lot of the battles would not have been won by our forces had we not been strafing, shooting rockets and bombs at the bad guys on the other side of the ridge. And it hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, and it's sort of like the Middle East. You know, we're flying sorties every day over there. When the troops see a IUD or whatever they call them, they're trying to blow them up, they go in and hit them with precision guided munitions. Well, they don't have the losses like we have. Joe Foss's squadron is still, his 121 squadron is over at Miramar, and a bunch of us put in some money and helped build a Joe Foss memorial room. And I went over there to visit with him, and the commander, they'd just gotten back from the Middle East, and I said, "How did you guys all fly full combat tour?" And he said, "Yeah, we did." I said, "How many planes and pilots did you lose?" And he said, "0." And I said, "Man, that's the legacy that we helped build up, so now they can go into a combat situation." And the Air Force is doing a tremendous job over there now with providing satellite coverage, intelligence coverage, transport, so the troops don't have to go down the roads, doing a lot of close support. Tremendous job, and I don't think the Air Force is getting proper recognition. Of course, I don't think any of the services are getting the recognition from the mainstream media like they should, like it did in World War II and even in Korea and Vietnam.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing. At the end of my interviews with the veterans, and unfortunately Tuesday night they cut the film off before we saw this, but I always ask for a salute into the camera. Can you do that when I ask you?
Sure.
Okay, from where you're seated though, okay. Give me a second here. Okay, Carl, right in the camera, go ahead. All right, excellent, thank you.